humans will be destroyed.
Following the success of Onimusha Warlords in 2001, Onimusha 2, Samurai's Destiny, was released exclusively for the PlayStation 2 a year later. Unlike the first game though, the player does not assume the role of Samanosuke Akechi from the first game. Instead, the main character of Onimusha 2 is a samurai named Jubei Yagyu, based off historical figure Munetoshi Yagyu, and modelled off the late Japanese actor Yusaku Matsuda. But can Onimusha 2 live up to the success of its predecessor? Find out on the final episode of A Journalistic Review. Taking place in 1571, approximately 10 years after the events of Onimusha Warlords, our villain Nobunaga Oda, who had now become Lord of the Genma, had amassed an army with the intention of conquering Japan. One of the targets in his reign of terror is unfortunately Yagyu Village, and the opening cinematic graphically illustrates the massacre that took place there. Our hero Jubei, who is out of the village at the time, rushes back home to witness the aftermath. Visibly angry, which I guess is understandable given the fact that your village was destroyed, a mysterious voice calls out for Jubei, and his journey begins. Over the course of his adventures, Jubei meets up with some allies who will aid him on his quest. Ike Ankakuji, a Buddhist monk who is also a master of the Hozoen spear style, Magoichi Saiga, the leader of the Kishu Saiga gun team, Kotaro Fuma, the leader of the Fuma ninja clan, and the mysterious Oyu, a female warrior who fights using a western sword and shield. All of these characters were based off historical figures during that time period in Japan. Onimusha 2 for the most part plays very similar to Onimusha. However, the game does introduce some new features such as a currency system as well as a gift system. Although they look basic from the gameplay, the gift system does play a very important role in the story of the game, which I'll talk about later. Also introduced in the game for the first time is the Oni Awakening ability. So over the course of the game, large purple souls may appear from an enemy. When Jubei absorbs 5 of them, he briefly and automatically transforms into the Onimusha. In this form he is invincible and his attacks deal much more damage. Throughout the game you also have the opportunity to play as Jubei's allies too, which certainly adds to the gameplay. But enough about that, we'll move right on to the next part of this review. The good. The setting of the game was, in my opinion, pretty well done. As well as Yagyu Village, your journey takes you to a number of new places, and for those who have played Onimusha Warlords, some familiar places too. However, the central area for about half the game is the mining town of Imasho. The gold that you pick up from killing Genma around the town is required to buy a mountain pass early on in the game, as well as buying gifts for your allies. The gift system I mentioned earlier plays a big part in this game, as this influences which allies help you, as well as their fates later on in the game. This adds to the replayability factor of the game, as you can experiment around with what happens if you prefer one ally over another. The game makes it easy to see which character likes what items, and items that characters don't like in particular, they'll outright refuse. As in Onimusha Warlords, the ability to play as Jubei's allies was a pretty neat feature as well. For this review I'm going to go over the segment in which you play as Oyu. The playstyle is a little different from Jubei, as opposed to having a magical attack like Jubei or Samanosuke in the previous game. Her sword glows red when she initiates her special attack, and while it's red you're able to absorb more souls. Oyu also has access to a bunch of throwing weapons, very similar to how Kaede had her kunais in Onimusha Warlords. By and by you may have noticed, Jubei's allies are capable of absorbing souls when you're playing as them. This does make the task of enhancing Jubei's weapons, and in this game armour, a slightly easier task. I also like how the weapons worked in Onimusha 2. As opposed to Samanosuke getting 2 swords and a naginata, Jubei has more varied weapons such as a spear and a hammer. On top of that, weapons have tech attacks too, which add to the type of attacks that Jubei can use against the Genma. The new weapons introduced also have new elements as well, such as the spear having ice powers and the hammer having earth powers. I like the trick chests in this game as well. In this game you have to complete a symbol by sliding panels around, and while some are pretty easy, others can be pretty tricky to work out. The other puzzles in this game also didn't feel tacked on, but more or less flowed very well with the story, acting as obstacles in order for you to progress further. Boss fights were pretty interesting too. Even though you fight a couple of them multiple times, I found the boss fights in Onimusha 2 to be more challenging to the fights in Onimusha Warlords, as a lot of the bosses had more unblockable attacks, forcing me to change my strategy. As good as these new changes are though, there's one thing that won't be changing, and that is the bag. Now, I might have said some good things about the weapons earlier, but aside from the spear and the hammer, the other weapons you get are a thunder sword, a double-bladed wind sword, and what appears to be a broadsword with the power of fire. Sound familiar? Samanosuke, funny enough, carries a thunder sword, the wind naginata looks very similar to the wind sword, and Jubei's ultimate weapon, the Rekka Ken, shares many similarities to Samanosuke's fire broadsword in combination with the Bishamon sword. While I appreciate that Jubei has more weapon variety, I just can't help but feel that those weapons are just simply clones of Samanosuke's weapons when it comes down to basic and special attacks. The controls still haven't changed. You still use the D-pad to move Jubei and his friends around, but this time there's a puzzle which requires you to rotate the analog sticks. So this time the game acknowledges the use of analog sticks, but they're not used for basic movement. Just my opinion here, but that just feels really stupid to me. The last couple of fights seem a bit anticlimactic. For once you do fight Nobunaga, but once you've beaten him, he possesses a giant golden statue. While I won't spoil the ending, the idea of fighting a giant golden statue that sends giant faces after you is a bit far-fetched in comparison to Fortinbras and Onimusha. Then again, I did have to fight Genma robots too, which did seem a little stupid too. I also felt that once you met Jujudorma, the game locks you into progressing through to the final fight. So if you haven't influenced who you wanted to have as an ally by then, you're virtually out of luck, and it locks you in a particular storyline for good. So in my first playthrough, the only ally to really help me from that point was Eke in Oyu, mainly as she's part of the story, whereas Magoichi and Kotaro are nowhere to be seen for the rest of the game. As a matter of fact, you don't even hear from them ever again. With that out of the way, I'll move on to The Ugly, where I discuss the visuals. The game still uses pre-rendered backgrounds, which I think still look great. The FMV video at the start of the game looks very well done, especially in regards to the massacre on Yagyu Village. And overall, I think in terms of visuals, Onimusha 2 really steps it up a notch from Onimusha. There's still clipping and minor perspective issues, but I can generally ignore these. The revision to Gifu Castle looks nice and certainly holds the creepy atmosphere present in the first game. Weapon attacks still look awesome, and although I did criticise the Thunder Sword, I still like how cool its magic attack is. I swear those thunder weapons have probably got to be my favourite swords in the whole series. I also like the critical attacks as well, or Isen as they like to call it. There's actually an entire difficulty level in which the only way to kill an enemy is by using one of those critical hits. Now, those were present in Onimusha 1, but in Onimusha 2 they look a lot more flashy and much more impressive. And Isens either destroy a normal enemy, or in a boss's case, it basically takes a huge chunk of health off them. Either way, it still looks pretty damn cool. Overall though, as impressed as I was with all of the improvements Onimusha 2 had in a lot of ways compared to Onimusha Warlords, I feel that the one thing that seems lacking to me was the creepy atmosphere from Onimusha. Something about exploring a deserted castle keep with Genma all over the place really nailed it for me. I wasn't really feeling it with a lot of the locations outside of Gifu Castle in 2, but I feel that it could have been because Onimusha was starting to head more towards action as opposed to survival horror. But if you enjoyed playing Onimusha Warlords, this game certainly won't disappoint you, as it pretty much takes a lot of what the original had and improves it. But I still prefer the original solely on atmosphere. So with that, I'm going to give Onimusha 2, Samurai's Destiny, a tiger out of a phoenix. And with that, we reach the end of a journalistic review. Stay tuned for the first review in its rebranded name, Infinite Backlog.